Well, good afternoon, everyone, and we hope everyone had a nice Memorial Day weekend. I want to welcome you all to the third in a series that we have been doing on Alaska Natives, American Indian, and childcare in particular. The title of this one is Tribes and States Working Together for Our AIAN Children. So what we're going to do today is a combination of interviews with people that we filmed in advance, as well as in-person panel. I want to open this by, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Linda Smith, and I am the director of the Early Childhood Initiative here at the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. And in that capacity, the Bipartisan Policy Center is a Washington, D.C. based think tank that tries to take the best ideas from both sides of the aisle to propose policies that meet the needs of all of our families. So I want to open this by giving some shout outs and some thank yous to some people who have helped us with this particular project. First of all, Heising Simons Foundation has funded this work, and Barbara Chow for her support of all of this. Then the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University and Chantel Meek, who started the conversation working with BPC on what is the report Start with Equity, where we started to look into some of the issues of early childhood and the equity for some of our populations. Next, Barb Faber, who's going to be joining us here in a second, co-hosting this, but who's been working with us on this project now for quite some time. She is the founder and CEO of Indigenous Visioning. Then we need to thank the Office of Child Care at HHS and Don Ramsberg in particular, who helped us in giving us access to the tribal child care plans, and which then set the stage for our report, Righting a Wrong, Advancing Equity and Childcare Funding for AIAN Families. And then finally, the National Indian Child Care Association and Jennifer Radcliffe for their help in helping us think through the tribal childcare plans and what we should be looking at and trying to analyze. So as I said, this is the third in a series, the first two, then the first of the series, and I would encourage people to go back, if you didn't get to see them, to go back and watch them. And we'll give you links in the chat for both the first and second of the series. In the first of the series, we had Senator Byron Dorgan with us, who was the former chair of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee and a senator from the state of North Dakota. He wrote a book called The Girl in the Photograph, and it's a very moving story of someone he met along through his career. And the second person on that was Anton Truer, and I highly recommend to people interested in this topic, his book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask. Both of those books are worth the time for those interested in this topic. And then the second session that we had the lieutenant governor from the state of Minnesota, who is herself a Native American, talk to us about the relations with the state and the tribes in Minnesota and how they've worked to improve government relations and work and respect tribal sovereignty. And then along with her, we had Bettina Parks, who talked to us about what is sovereignty. And finally, Melanie Benjamin, who is herself a chief executive of the Malawi Band of Ojibwe. I knew I was going to stumble on that one, in Minnesota. And they talked about what sovereignty means both directions, from the state, but also from the tribes. So now what we're going to do, building off of the work we did with the Start with Equity, which really talked to us about some alarming data in terms of our Native American children. Basically, in that report, we found that although Native American children are less than 1% of the population, they account for 9% of the reports of corporal discipline incidents in this country. And in the state of California alone, Native American boys are 2.5 times, and girls 3.7 times as likely to be suspended from early childhood settings. So we wanted to actually take a look at that and what is going on with some of the, the state relations and what's going on with our children in some of these programs. So with that in mind, that sets the stage for what we're going to do today. We're talking to representatives from 3 different states, North Dakota, Oregon, and New Mexico. And we're going to dig into the tribal state relations. And these actually happen to be states with really great examples of how they've worked cooperatively between the state and the tribes, in hopes that we can give other states some ideas on how they could work to improve relations with their tribes within their state and their communities. So with that said, I'm going to bring Barb Faber in as co-host on this now, and welcome back, Barb. And thank you for being with us again here. Barb did the interview with our first speaker today, and this is a taped interview that Barb did a while back with Kirsten Basler, who is the state superintendent of schools in North Dakota. She had several very interesting and I thought heartfelt things to say about the relations in the state. So Barb, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you introduce some of the remarks, because you actually did that interview.
Bonjour, good afternoon. This is Barb Faber, as Linda mentioned. And I'm so honored to be a part of these webinar series. We've learned so much over the last 3 sessions, and it's, there's many states that do it very well, and some states there's, a little behind. But I think this webinar series will really help everybody really see what the potential is for tribal and state collaborations. It's just a win-win for everybody. And I was really honored to interview Kirsten Basler, as you said. She's the state superintendent for North Dakota Department of Public Instruction. And Kirsten really had some meaningful remarks. She talked about meaningful consultation. And a consultation is not when you deliver a memo, an email, or you request that through email. It's really a deep and engaging conversation. And it's one where the states, really should be reaching out to the tribes in their state and develop relationships. I think that was her message, is that those relationships with it, like anything in our lives, our professional lives, our personal lives, it takes time and effort and genuine. It's not, thinking about tribes as an afterthought. It's really having those upfront conversations with them, not after the fact, to have the tribes at the table helping make those decisions, and asking the tribes what their perspective is on it. And I think it was just a mutual respect back and forth. And Kirsten provided several, I think, useful tips, as you'll see in the interview. And she was such a delight to interview, because she was so enthusiastic about it. And it was very genuine. And you'll see that in the interview. So with that, I think we could probably turn it over to the interview and listen to Kirsten.
So the North Dakota tribal nations are sovereign nations that function independently outside of state and federal government. And so as we talk about government to government relationships, that is the relationship that I have with each of our tribal governments in the state of North Dakota. They have their own laws to govern within their jurisdiction. They have their own governments and their own policies that we as a nation need to work with. So that's what sovereignty means to me.
Okay, so then we have another clip of Kirsten and what she's learned, I think, from working with tribes, and what advice she would give to other people. So we can go to the next clip with Kirsten.
Well, fundamentally and essentially, it's to create a better North Dakota for all of us. for every single individual citizen, from native to non-native, from 6-week-olds to 89, 90-year-olds. When we work together and communicate with each other, we create a better North Dakota. And this is often what I say to our legislators and policymakers, our decision makers, is to say, if we really want to have economic growth in North Dakota, if we really want to be that sustainable future that all of our children and grandchildren are choosing to stay and work and raise their own families, then all of us need to be successful. All of us need to understand, and all of us need to be engaged in and invested in other people's success. And so I think the only way that can really happen is when you have government to government relations that are truly communicating with each other. And I think that's so important. That's why we developed the North Dakota Indian Education Advisory Council years and years ago, and why for me, tribal consultation meetings are so important to just improve communication and having meaningful consultation. And so, and that's a very important part of how I think you probably heard me stress the word consultation, or meaningful consultation, because it must be meaningful. It must be authentic. And when you have consultation, it can't be a report out. That's not communication. That's somebody giving a report, and you may have some people listening and you may not. But when you have a meaningful consultation, you're at a table together, government to government, speaking about what the needs are of one government, and the other side saying, this is what we need as this government. And we have a common goal to drive toward that will benefit all of us. And that's the consultation that must take place.
I think we skipped ahead a little bit there, and I think the next clip is where Kirsten actually talks a little bit more about what she's learned from all of this. So let's keep going with the clips here.
Boy, what have I learned? Boy, I've learned a lot, and some of them, as life occurs, as we all know, some are easier lessons, some are harder lessons, some have, less important consequences, and some have very important consequences. But I think the key is that there's been learning. And it's interesting, we were talking before about everything that you've wanted to ask a Native American or an Indian and were too afraid to ask. That really resonated with me. I believe it was another guest that you'd had on, and that really resonated with me because I was in my first 6 months of my first term in office, and I had been invited down to visit Standing Rock Nation and visit with the tribal leaders and the school leaders down at Standing Rock. And I guess I should point out that I grew up 30 minutes from Standing Rock's borders. And so many of my friends were, students at Solon High School and Selfridge and Fort Yates Public and Standing Rock Community High School. And so I was not foreign. We ran track together. We played basketball together. We would meet uptown, what we called, it was our capital city. We'd go uptown to Bismarck and we would, have, so I felt like, I shouldn't be naive or foreign to people that are living on Standing Rock, but I was incredibly nervous. And as we were driving down to Standing Rock, I was driving with the North Dakota Indian Affairs Commissioner, the governor's cabinet member. His name is Scott Davis. And Scott and I were friends. I'd known each other before, and we're driving down. And as we're driving, I said, Scott, I just have some questions. And I said, is it Native American? Is it Indian? And that was maybe one of my first questions. I said, I just don't want to misstep. I know that, trust and respect is very important as we have government to government conversations. And Scott actually just stopped the car. He pulled off the side of the road and he just looked at me. He said, just ask. If there's anything that you need to know or want to know, just ask. And it was the best piece of advice that I could have gotten within my first year. It was the first 6 months in my term in office, because it really did set the stage for what I think has grown into be a better relationship each and every month that we are working together, because there's a sense of humility. There's a sense of vulnerability that goes along when a person coming from the Capitol, right? And it's a statewide elected official, me not assuming that I knew everything, and not pretending that I knew everything, but really was able to open myself up to be vulnerable and to be very humble to say, can you tell me about this? I don't want to pretend to know. And so that was the first conversation. And really, it was even before tribal consultations were required by the Elementary Secondary Education Act. But it was our first moment of consultation that was put together through a deep desire to better know and understand each other. And so I guess that's what I've learned. That's the first lesson that I learned. And the advice that I would give to anybody on either side is to be honest, be humble, and be vulnerable. It's okay to be vulnerable, because I believe that progress travels through the speed of trust. And you cannot make progress and improve anything until you trust each other and authentically trust each other. So I think in order to have authentic trust and long-lasting sustainable trust, you have to be humble, you have to be vulnerable, and you have to be honest. So that was the first lesson. I've learned many, though.
So you can see what a wonderful interview that was. And she had a lot of great information. So now I think I'm going to turn it back over to you, Linda, so you can introduce our next speaker.
Okay, well, the next thing, I think we had one more clip of Kirsten, if I'm not mistaken, that taught before we get to the next speaker. I think what our final question for Kirsten was just generally her thoughts on the urban population and how we should go about meeting their needs. And I think she had some very thoughtful things to say. So before we get to the next one, let's do that clip as well.
Great idea. Yes.
We have to understand that these are all of our citizens. And we will never be the best North Dakota that we are going to be until all of our citizens are healthy, safe, have proper nutrition, proper housing, proper childcare, so they can enter into the work world.
Keep going, Greg.
Childcare, childcare, childcare. And can I just say one more time, quality childcare, quality support services for families that will thrive when they have the right supports and services. Too often we are trying to catch up and provide some remediation, if you will, where if we would only invest in that young family, that working family that just needs some extra support, or that first time mother that has all the dreams and aspirations that all of us as parents do, the first time parents do, but might just need a little bit more assistance. So again, a resource in a place and in a setting to do that. And for particularly as we're speaking just to our Native American citizens in North Dakota, services that are culturally relevant, services that are culturally supportive, that they feel welcome and at home, because people laugh like they do. They have the same sense of humor. They have the same traditions of faith and spirit and religion and values.
You know, we can't say enough how important the urban population is for all of us to address. One of the things that we found in our work in looking at the whole issue of, you know, where are services for our Native American population is that close to 3/4 of families don't live on tribal land. So this is not an insignificant issue for us that we need to take seriously and figure out how we're going to meet those needs both on and off our tribal lands. So now we're going to skip and go forward to another clip that we did with someone that I think the audience will recognize, at least most of the early childhood community, Elizabeth Gerginski, who is the cabinet secretary now for the New Mexico Early Childhood and Care Department. And Elizabeth was new to New Mexico and new to working with the Native American community. And so we asked Elizabeth what she had to say, what she learned, and how she approached it when she first moved to New Mexico, and has really taken this as a very sincere and heartfelt issue. And you're going to hear that as you hear from Elizabeth. So let's listen to her, and then we'll go to our panel.
Yes, well, I think most importantly is the role of our Assistant Secretary of Native American Early Education and Care, which is part of the new department structure. And because New Mexico has a strong state tribal consultation act, the Indian Education Act, it was very important, obviously, as the secretary that I had to learn. And so I was grateful that I had Assistant Secretary Archuleta, who had just come from working with many of the 8 northern pueblos on early childhood strategic planning. So that was a great benefit to me as someone new to the state and new to working with tribal governments. And so it really was the leadership of Assistant Secretary Archuleta who helped me establish, those beginning relationships, teaching me about the etiquette, teaching me about how we engage with in each of the 23 tribes, pueblos, and nations. A message that I heard from her and many others was each of these sovereign nations are unique. So don't come with an attitude that, oh, you're all Native American communities, this is how we work. So being respectful and taking the time to learn and understand how each of these unique sovereign nations operates, especially around early childhood. Some have Head Start, some have childcare, some have both, some don't. And so I would say I'm still on a pretty big learning curve. But again, having Assistant Secretary Archuleta and Assistant Secretary So at the Public Education Department and the governor and her team, who are deeply committed to righting the wrongs and to building strong relationships with all of our sovereign governments and making sure that we're in partnership and collaboration. I think the whole role of consultation is so fascinating and wonderful. Ongoing consultation, as I learned, it's not a one time. And so in those consultations that we were able to have, just learning about that respect and that engagement and recognizing and acknowledging the unique way that each of these tribal leaders operates within their governments.
Okay, so, well, Elizabeth set Giovanna up nicely in terms of giving her rave reviews before she even gets on, but Giovanna is with us today in the panel discussion that we're going to have right now, along with Chris O'Grady, who is the state child care administrator in Oregon. And we interviewed both of these people, but brought them on live because they are doing so many fascinating things in their respective states to work with the tribal community and to really bring this issue full front and make it a meaningful effort in their state. So what we will do, I'm not going to read their bios. Their bios will be posted in the chat, but I do want to welcome Giovanna Archuleta, who's the Assistant Secretary in New Mexico, and Chris O'Grady with Oregon. And then actually want to start by asking you each to tell us a little bit more about your role within your respective states and how you work with the Native American communities. And I should note that both of these ladies are Native American themselves, and I think that gives them a special understanding, but I think they could have advice for everyone regardless. So let's start with you, Giovanna.
So good afternoon, everyone. Giovanna Archuleta, as Linda said, Assistant Secretary for Native American Early Education and Care in New Mexico. And my position was specifically requested by the tribal leaders of New Mexico that there be an assistant secretary within the early childhood department. So when the bill was written, I was written into it. Well, the position was written into it. I was later nominated by the tribal leaders to sit in this position and do the work of strengthening those government to government relationships, advocating for funding. And for the first time this year, we got funding specifically to tribal communities to increase and enhance early childhood programming.
Well, that's fabulous. And so your position was actually written into law in New Mexico.
It was written into law, yes.
That's great. Okay. That is, I should say, one of the recommendations that we've made in the report that we did where we analyzed the state childcare plans. And we actually make a recommendation that every state with a, a significant tribal population do exactly what New Mexico did. So congrats to you and to the state. Chris, what about you?
Greetings. Good day, everyone. My name is Chris O'Grady, and I would say as the CCDF administrator for the state of Oregon, we were working really closely with our tribal CCDF administrators in monthly meetings and in our government to government cluster meetings on education and Department of Human Services, in consultation with the tribes to make sure they have everything that we needed. When I came to the early learning division in Oregon, we didn't have a tribal affairs manager. So as part of my role as CCDF administrator, we created a legislative package that created a tribal affairs coordinator position. And we have since hired for that position and it has now been made permanent. One of the other changes that happened within our division is we passed legislation to create a tribal early learning hub. So this would be a hub for the 9 tribal nations within Oregon to work together on early childhood strategic planning. And so when that legislation passed and we began planning for our tribal early learning hub, we also carved out a committee in our early learning council, which is our governance over the early learning division, to create a tribal advisory committee with representatives from the 9 tribes to really lead this work moving forward, and moving forward what we're doing within early childhood and what our consultation process looks like.
Wow. So both of you actually have very specific processes about consultation, correct? And what that actually means within your states. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I think Kirsten said it and Elizabeth said it as well. These are not one-off conversations. They need to be ongoing and meaningful. Can you tell us how you do that? Let's go, Chris, first to you, and then we'll go back to Giovanna.
Yeah. So within each sector of governance, so the governor's office meets with the tribal nations and so does the legislature, but we have different sectors of government to government cluster meetings, and this is where we really oversee our memorandums of understanding between the state and the tribal governments in the different areas. But as CCDF administrator, part of the consultation process that I engage with is with the tribes is having monthly engagement meetings where we consult with the tribal nations on what their tribal CCDF plans are and what ours are, how we can better serve and work together and build off of the funding that they receive in the block grant to serve their tribal members. And we cover everything from background checks to what we do in licensing and regulation, and how we can address the needs of the tribal nations and their members in different early childhood programs that we have.
And Giovanna, what about in New Mexico? How does that work?
We meet and request government to government consultation with the tribal leader. So whether it's the governor or the president, myself and Secretary Goginski will go out to the community and have consultation around a topic. So right now we're about to head out again next week to meet with 4 other communities to talk about that first time investments we got this year in this legislative session. And just to hear directly from tribal leaders, what can that funding be used for? How can we fill any gaps right now? What does future funding look like? So that's one example of conversation we're having. There'll be other topics that would come up. Just tomorrow, we're heading to the Tribal Summit. It's part of the State Tribal Collaboration Act, where governors and presidents of the 23 tribes, pueblos, and nations will meet with Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham from the state, and we'll have that conversation around education and really supporting the vision of Governor Lujan Grisham from cradle to career. So we'll partner with our PED, our public ed folks, our higher ed folks, and then early ed to have conversations around education.
You know, both of you have mentioned governors and what their role is. And obviously, governors are involved as they were in the state of Minnesota with the lieutenant governor's office there. How did that come to be? Is that just, has that been traditionally in your state, or was this something new? Giovanna, let's go to you first on that.
It's been tradition in our state. I mean, we have the Indian Affairs Department, which was established to foster those relationships with the 23 tribes, pueblos, and nations. And we have the acts in place that are mandated that the governor of the state meet with the governors and presidents of the tribes, pueblos, and nations.
And Chris, what about you? Do you have what about how your governor got involved in, and can you talk a little bit more? Do you have a law or an act similar to what New Mexico has?
Yeah, I think it's really been a priority for Governor Brown when she's been in office. I don't think historically, since the beginning of statehood for Oregon, it has been a priority in the governor's office, but we also have the Indian Education Act, and our current governor really does make this a priority. I think because tribes are sovereign nations, it's really important that you have top leaders engaging with their top leaders of governance. It would be as if our governor was meeting with the leaders of the federal government. And that's the way we see that relationship, because our tribes are sovereign nations. So it's really important to show that respect of the governance structure and having those meetings in between leadership.
And Giovanna, you actually mentioned, I think, in one of the conversations that we've had about how do you enter, into when you're going out to visit a tribal community, how do you do that? Because I think that this was an important thing that I heard in the conversations with along the way, is that you start with the tribal leadership. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, just like traditionally and how I've grown up is we ask first for the permission to work with their communities. We ask permission from the leader to enter. And so that is where we start. And leaders change in our communities yearly, some every other year, some around 3 years, but still that requires that same permission every year. And so that is where we enter in with an agenda. A proposed agenda is how we title it, because that agenda is supposed to be crafted in consultation amongst each other on topics that we have.
I hear both of you saying, and we've heard it on all of in all of the conversations we've had, is it just starts with respect, and not making assumptions about things. And, this consultation, I think, is all about respect. It sounds like both of you have really, got that lesson down. Barb, I want to bring you into this conversation now, because several things that I think you've talked about in when we've done the interviews about sort of what are people proud of? What would you say that you've learned from the interviews we've done?
I believe how genuine the people are. I mean, they really want to have that relationship, a genuine relationship with the tribes. And, some have gone so far as to put it in legislation. And like Minnesota, they have tribal liaisons in just about every branch. And so it's really how states want to do it. Everybody does it differently, and there's no right or wrong. The only wrong is by not doing it, not having those consultations. And and then I know the urban issue is one that I would like to ask our panel, is how their states are providing services to the Native families that are living off the reservation or the service area of, and not in that, more in the urban settings. So would I be able to first ask Chris how they do it?
Yes, in consultation and conversation with our tribes, we've really heard that there's a need to serve these urban populations because they are restricted within specifically their childcare and development funds for childcare, as well as some other federal funding that they receive from the federal government to their tribal service area. And many of their tribal members actually have moved to pursue educational or different economic opportunities, and they're not able to then reach them when they're not in their tribal service area, or maybe even have moved out of state. There are also intentional displacement programs that were put in place by federal government that moved Native people into urban centers. So there is that huge population and need there in urban centers that was done from displacement, but also because of tribal members' own need to move somewhere else to pursue opportunities. So we've been working with our tribal nations to see how we can better serve those needs and partner with the different resource centers that we have. In particular, we have the Native American Youth and Family Center, or called NAYA, in Portland, and they have their own Head Start program. And we developed a fund in consultation with our tribal leaders called the Early Childhood Equity Fund. And the Urban Native Resource Center, NAYA, is able to apply for funds and get specific grants to supplement the funding for the Head Start program, as well as do parent programming and other programming for children and families engaged in that.
Giovanna, what about, in New Mexico?
We are a huge state, and so we have many of urban population in the Albuquerque metro area. And so what we have just launched, just keep in mind, we're still a year and a half old, so we're growing as an agency. But we just launched last Wednesday a tribal advisory coalition, which makes up individuals appointed by tribal leaders in addition to urban population representatives. So we have individuals starting language nest to preserve language in the metro area. We have the Native American Community Academy, which serves a lot of children in the urban population. So we're bringing them on board to help us develop policies, advocacy, and that way, as we continue to grow as an agency, we continue to think about urban population and investments into the Albuquerque area.
I think that was one of the things that we found in our looking at the tribal childcare plans was this big gap, not just with, between the urban and the tribal programs themselves, but between there's just not enough money to go around in the tribal childcare program we're only serving, I think we looked at 184 tribal plans out of 574 tribes. So we know that we've only scratched the surface with the funding. So how do we begin to understand the gap and where that gap exists? I think is going to be a challenge of the next couple of years. But I think we really have to figure it out if we're going to get these families the services that they need. Can you guys think of any other things that you would advise other states to do in terms of outreach to their urban populations that we haven't covered? Let's start with Chris.
Yeah, I think it's also, you mentioned that tribal childcare and development fund plans, working with tribes to see how you can get childcare subsidy vouchers to their members, maybe in other states. So having conversations with the tribes that you are in consultation with and other states to see what they can do in creating a priority for all American Indian and Alaska Native children and families in accessing their child care subsidy plans, and in conversations that you've done or lessons learned in that way. I would also say in finding different ways to support childcare programs and parenting programs that have different access to cultural resources. In addition to our Safe Sleep campaign that we're doing now, we are also revisiting our licensing rules to see how we can insert the latest research around using cradle boards and making that allowance for childcare providers in a culturally relevant context. And that's something that we hadn't been able to do before.
It's very interesting that you say that because, some of you know, and we'll put a link to this in the chat. We did, I think, the first national survey of Native American parents. And one of the things that they told us in that survey was that they really they would prefer to have programs that are sponsored by the tribes because of the cultural issues. They really want to access to those. And so how do we get them access and make sure that they're culturally relevant? And I think what you just said there, Chris, is very important, that we don't oversimplify some of what is involved with the cultural aspects of these programs. So Giovanna, what about you and New Mexico on that one?
Well, in one of our consultations we had a few weeks back, the governor specifically asked us, come out to our community, host a community night. Let's talk about how we not only build the child care providers, but how we share information about child care assistance. So on Monday, we'll be in the community on an evening, and we're partnering with one of our local foundations who's going to provide food. And that way we can have a community night and build those providers and provide information around child care assistance, because that is lacking. And we've also invested in facility assessments, because that is also an area where we've heard the gap is really healthy and safe early childhood environments and facilities. And so that is where we have started as well.
One of the things that we have noticed in all of the work that we've done, I think I mentioned this earlier, is just that there's just a glaring lack of data in so many areas. When we looked at different departments and the data, it's so sketchy. And I was just wondering what you guys think. What is the one thing that you'd like to know that you don't know about your Native American populations in your states? Chris, let's go to you.
Yeah, I think that's something really important to point out. Often in large data sets, American Indian and Alaska Native is such a small percentage of the larger data set that is often left out or lumped into another category. It's important that we still capture that information and tribal affiliation. If we are able to get to that level of granular data, it can really tell us a lot, because not all of our cultures are the same and there are really unique differences. One project that I'm really looking forward to, that we're just getting started on the state, is tracking our tribally operated and tribally affiliated childcare programs in our licensing department, as well as that are active in our childcare subsidy programs, so that we can see what specialized support we can give to these programs or childcare providers who may be serving a significant portion of American Indian and Alaska Native families, and what specialized support that they would need. We currently don't have that data or don't check that, and that could be a really great source of data sharing and information sharing within our tribal nations, because they really want to know who are their tribal child care providers that may be members that they can extend services to, and where are their tribal members accessing childcare, so that they can also reach out to those folks and give them specific resources for their families.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. How about you, Giovanna, on that?
I think it goes back to the urban population, because we don't know exactly how many we have living in Albuquerque metro area. I mean, I think our tribes have enrollment, so they'd be able to keep track of, as long as they're enrolled and living in community, but that is a big gap.
But you at the state level don't know that, is what you're saying. Yeah. I think we really found that the lack of data to be problematic. And, you know, as some of you have heard me say, one of the things that we found and we recommend in our report that we did on righting a wrong is that we need better data, because we are not basing the funding that Congress gives on any kind of data. It's always, as I like to say, it's sort of an, oh, by the way, give the tribes 2% or 3% or 4%. That's not based on need at all. And I think that's one of the places we need to start. So this data is a really big, I think, barrier to getting services to the children and families that need it. So I think what I really like to hear you all say, what is, you know, before we go and take questions from the audience, what one thing would you say, what piece of advice would you give to other states that have yet to genuinely engage with their tribal communities? what would you tell them is step 1, 2, or 3? What should they do that would help make this, this help correct this problem? So Giovanna, you're on screen. Why don't we start with you?
I think do the research about the community before entering, and then make that engagement to understand who the leadership is and contact leadership.
Okay, and Chris?
It starts with relationship building. So again, do the research, know what promises and priorities and maybe even treaty rights that you've had with your tribal nations that you have been engaged in, and maybe what wrongs need to be righted in conversation, and then start reaching out and reach out consistently. There is a burden on you to make sure that you build that relationship within the state government and have that outreach. A lot of tribal nations and tribal governments, they have limited resources in terms of staff. So you should be dedicating staff funding to structuring the time to create meeting spaces, and at a time that's convenient for tribal leadership and tribal governance, because you have an obligation in that sovereign nation to state relationship to take that on.
I think you guys have made some of the same points that we've heard in some of the previous sessions that we've had. And I'm going to recap some of those and see what you would add to this list, because I think we've heard in every session meaningful communication, meaningful consultation, meaningful. That seems to be the word that people keep using, not just check a box kind of thing, and authentic, however you want to describe it. That's one thing. That this takes time and effort. And I think we've heard that 3 times in a row now. Trust and respect. And I think I keep hearing the word respect over and over and over again. And trust, and I see that we hear be honest with people. And I think this trust comes from honesty. So I think that we've heard that. I think the 2 catchwords that I heard Kirsten Baszler say, I think is so true. We heard it from Senator Dorgan, from Anton Truer. We heard it from the folks in Minnesota. Just ask the questions. Don't be afraid to ask people what you don't know, and don't assume, because that gets you in trouble as well. Where's leadership? And I think that leadership is really important. We've heard it throughout. Without leadership, starting probably with your governors, but it certainly can start within the cabinet situations. Dedicated staff. You guys are both dedicated to this issue. How do we get dedicated staff in these, in all of our state governments, so that we can really get something to happen? So I think we're going to go to questions, and we have several in the chat right now. So let me take a look at what we have. Say, what specifically can states do to help and support tribes secure childcare while still respecting sovereignty and self-determination of tribes? Respectfully, what things should states avoid when collaborating with tribes? Let's take that last one. What should states avoid? What do you think states may or may not be doing right? Let's start with you, Chris. Put you on the spot here.
Create flexible funding sources to fund early childhood and learning programs. You don't get to set the priorities for a tribe and what they want to teach their littles and their families. They should be able to make those priorities on their own. I think that's why a lot of federal and state funding and programs haven't worked in the past, is because the priorities for tribal communities were set by someone else. They should be able to set those priorities and use the funds in a way that they see fit to serve their children and families.
I'm pretty sure Giovanna would second that, but Giovanna, what else would you say there?
What things should states avoid? I think trying to fit into a norm that's usually done in state government is took us a lot of learning and unlearning on how we can support educational sovereignty. So just do some unlearning when you go into those governmental agreements. It does not have to be structured in a way that's always been done. There's opportunity to support sovereignty.
You know, it's really interesting because one of the things when we started this work and when we started doing this particular series was looking at sovereignty, because I think that there's a lot of, or a lack of understanding in a lot of places about what sovereignty means. And I think if we haven't done anything over the last several sessions, it's to clarify what that is. And that sovereignty really is government to government relations, and that tribes are sovereign nations. And so entering into the work with that in mind, I think clarifies a lot. And, you know, I've said this before, as some of you know, I was born and raised on a reservation, and I can honestly say that I did not understand sovereignty until we started digging into it with this series. So I think it's pretty important that people do understand it. We have a question here. Are there any leading examples of how state tribal cooperation has led to beneficial outcomes for children in your state? What lessons can we take from those examples to generalize to other states and tribes? I can kind of jump in while I give you guys time to think about this question. I know when we interviewed Kirsten, and maybe Barb, you remember what she said, but I know that I've heard her say in the past, her work with the tribal governments has led to much higher graduation rates of the Native population from high school in the state of North Dakota. Now, I don't have the data on that, but Barb, do you remember that in the conversation we had with Kirsten?
Yes. So they looked at the data. They looked at what their state collected, and they looked at the graduation rates, and they were not happy with what they seen. So they pretty much rolled up their sleeves to really make a difference in that. And so they made a lot of changes that would help Native students stay in school. They worked with communities, and they really, on a state level, made every effort to work with the tribes to help change those numbers. And they have made some really progressive opportunities for students, and I think their numbers went up. I don't have the exact data right now, but the numbers were staggering. What they with what the amount of time that they did it in, and the result and the outcomes in the end were just amazing. So.
Okay, Giovanna, can Giovanna or Chris, can either one of you add to that? Chris?
We don't have longitudinal data, but Angie Blackwell from the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde has been on our Early Learning Council for a significant period of time and has really utilized different funding sources available and planning and strategic planning to help support the language revitalization efforts for her tribe in the early childhood community. And what we know about language revitalization efforts is that it is a huge contributor to child and family well-being. So we're really excited to see what the language revitalization looks like just for the overall health of that tribe and what that will mean for the overall health of children and families in that community as the program grows.
Yeah, you need to write that up. That would be very interesting to see that. Giovanna, can you think of anything in New Mexico?
I cannot at this moment. I think we'll have, give us 5 years and we'll have, I think, better data. But I just want to shout out to First Things First, who really works with Navajo Nation on the Arizona side, and they may have some specific lessons, examples, and I can, yeah.
We'll try to track that down. Thank you. One more question before we need to wrap it up, and we have a question here. What can the federal government and advocates do to support and foster relationships between tribal governments and state governments? What can the federal government do? And the advocates, I think we haven't engaged the advocacy community as well as we could. Giovanna, do you want to start on that?
I want to say that we come almost united when we go and visit with communities. That's really been our approach when we look at education as a whole in our state. And that has really built a foundation to collaboration, to consultation. And I don't know if I'm thinking off the fly here, like if a state and a federal government were to go in collaboration into a meeting and be united in how we look at either supporting, strengthening, and funding tribes, pueblos, and nations.
And Chris, how about you?
Yeah, and I think within the lens of the Child Care and Development Fund and within block grants is if the feds can have joint sessions with states and tribes on the development of their CCDF plans and know where there's areas of flexibility or leveraging resources or calculating higher rates for tribes to receive CCDF funds, that would be a huge area where we can see an amount of impact that tribes can use that funding for their children and families in this area.
You know, that was interesting in the work that we did in examining the tribal plans. What we found was the stark difference in just the amount of money per child between the tribal plans and what's allocated there and the state plans. And I do think that there's when you talk about an inequity, it's really right in those numbers. But again, you know, and one of the recommendations that we have made is that to make the tribal plans public. I mean, they're not right now posted. They haven't been. I think they're trying right now to get them all posted. But it's hard for states to work with tribes if they can't see the plans and they don't know. So.
And the plans are a huge administrative burden for tribes. They're almost 100 pages long. In the states, it's over 300 pages in many cases. So,
well, you know, trust me on this one, Chris. We looked at 184 of them, and they're closer to 180 pages long. we made some recommendations on that in terms of, you know, how do we use the data? Only collect what you can use, I think, is the first recommendation we would make on that. Because we collect more and then we don't use it, and then people, why bother? You know, so I think that we're running up against the clock here, and I want to thank our participants. Barb, did you want to ask another question?
No, I just wanted to say that, you know, with the question with what can the federal government do, and I think both ladies hit it, but I would also say that the federal government needs to work with the tribes and the states for the urban communities, because as you stated in the beginning, the plans only, for tribal plans, they only go as far as the service area, our reservation boundaries. As a former CCDF administrator, I received numerous calls from members in the metro area asking to get licensed for services because they did want that tribal perspective. So how can states and tribes and federal governments address the issue of the urban settings? So.
Yeah, and this is something where the federal government can set the table on this one, and the regions in particular. I know some regions also are more active in this than others, certainly. So, well, we want to thank both of you so much for taking the time, not only this time to talk with us live, but for the interviews that you have done. We will be putting all of this into a report summarizing what we've learned from these some of these sessions and what we've learned from you all in the states as to how we can, you know, move more states to take the kinds of action that Oregon and New Mexico and Minnesota and North Dakota have made, because I think it's in our best interest. I think I go back to what Kirsten said at one point, and I think she said it for all of us. they're all our children. I mean, wherever you live, whether it's North Dakota, Montana, New Mexico, we're all going to do better when we get together on this issue and really take it seriously. So with that, I want to thank everyone and say that we've appreciated what we've learned on this. We have one more of these sessions to go where we will talk to actual CCDF tribal people who do the CCDF program at the local level, and that will be the last of the series. So thank you all for bearing with us today, and especially the day after a holiday. So thank you, Barb, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Giovanna, and also in absentia to Elizabeth and Kirsten. So with that, we'll wrap it up, and everybody have a great day.